John Lennon was never generous with praise, especially when it came to his own work, and even more so when it came to the Beatles. For years after the band broke up, Lennon publicly tore apart his own catalog. He called songs lazy, albums bloated, ideas half-baked. Even classics weren't safe from his criticism. But hidden among the bitterness and revisionism, there were moments of honesty. Rare moments where Lennon admitted, this one mattered, not because it sold millions, not because fans loved it, but because it sounded like truth. These are the songs John Lennon openly admitted were truly brilliant, tracks he stood by even when he rejected much of the Beatles' legacy. And it begins with a song built on a stolen rhythm and turned into something unmistakably Lennon. Number 10, Come Together, 1969. Come Together was never meant to be a Beatles anthem. It began as a political chant Lennon wrote for Timothy Leary's failed campaign, loose, slurred, and deliberately murky. But when Leary's run collapsed, Lennon kept the song and reshaped it into something darker. John later admitted the groove was lifted from Chuck Berry's You Can't Catch Me. He never denied it. In fact, he owned it. But what mattered to Lennon wasn't originality and form. It was identity. And Come Together sounded like him. The lyrics were surreal, half-formed, and deliberately evasive. A parade of characters that made sense emotionally, not logically. Lennon loved that ambiguity. He once said the song worked because it didn't explain itself. It moved. What truly impressed Lennon was the restraint. No psychedelic excess, no grand statement, just a slow, heavy pulse, and a vocal delivery that felt dangerous and intimate at the same time. Years later, Lennon grouped Come Together with a small handful of Beatles songs he still respected. Not perfect, not pure, but unmistakably real. Number 9, Your Blues, 1968. Your Blues was born out of confinement, both physical and emotional. By the time the Beatles were recording the White Album, John Lennon felt completely detached from the band's image. They were too famous, too polished, too far removed from the raw pain he was experiencing. For Lennon, the blues wasn't a genre. It was a state of mind. Instead of recording the song in Abbey Road's main studio, Lennon demanded that the band move into a tiny, cramped side room. The space was suffocating, uncomfortable, and claustrophobic. Exactly what he wanted. George Martin was hesitant, but Lennon was firm. He wanted the sound to feel trapped, boxed in, and anxious. Inside that room, everything felt wrong. And that was the point. The amplifiers buzzed harshly. Ringo Starr's drums sounded heavy and restrained, lacking any sense of space. George Harrison's guitar cut through the mix with grit instead of clarity. Nothing was polished. Nothing was softened. This wasn't performance. It was release. Lyrically, Your Blues was brutally dark, even self-aware to the point of parody. Lennon later admitted that some lines were exaggerated, almost mocking traditional blues tropes. But the emotion behind them was real. He was mocking despair because he was drowning in it. Years later, Lennon said Your Blues was one of the very few Beatles songs he genuinely believed in. Not because it was clever, not because it was successful, but because it didn't pretend to be okay. It didn't want approval. It just wanted to exist. Number 8, Help, 1965.
I need somebody help, not just anybody.
By 1965, the Beatles were the biggest band on the planet, and John Lennon was quietly falling apart. Help! May sound upbeat, fast, and radio-friendly, but its creation came from exhaustion and fear. During the sessions, Lennon was overwhelmed by the pressure of fame, non-stop touring, and the sudden loss of privacy. The studio atmosphere was efficient, almost mechanical, but emotionally, Lennon felt anything but in control. Unlike later Beatles recordings filled with experimentation, Help was recorded quickly and cleanly. George Martin pushed for clarity and tightness, keeping the band on schedule. The tempo was sped up, partly to fit the film's energy, partly to disguise how vulnerable the song really was. In the studio, Lennon sang with urgency, almost shouting through the melody. Paul McCartney and George Harrison provided bright harmonies, unintentionally masking the desperation underneath. The contrast made the song palatable, and that bothered Lennon later. He said he wished he'd slowed it down, stripped it back, and let the pain show, because beneath the polish, help wasn't pop. It was a cry for survival. Number 7, Revolution, 1968. Revolution was born in an atmosphere of confusion, anger, and ideological fracture, not just in the world, but inside the Beatles themselves. By 1968, John Lennon was absorbing everything around him: student protests, anti-war movements, radical politics, and Yoko Ono's avant-garde worldview. When he brought Revolution into the studio, it wasn't a polished song. It was a question. Lennon wasn't sure where he stood, only that something felt wrong. The recording sessions were tense. There were 2 competing versions of the song from the start. Lennon wanted the slow, bluesy take, reflective, uncertain, and heavy. Paul McCartney pushed for something more direct, more radio-ready. George Martin, caught in the middle, watched the band argue not about notes, but about meaning. Eventually, both versions were recorded. The slow, introspective Revolution 1 felt like Lennon thinking out loud, but the single version, fast, distorted, aggressive, captured Lennon's rage. The guitars were overloaded to the point of breaking. The sound was raw, ugly, almost violent by pop standards. That distortion wasn't accidental. Lennon demanded it. He wanted the record to sound uncomfortable. Lyrically, he hesitated. Lines like, "Count me out," in, reflected his internal conflict, wanting change, but fearing extremism. In the studio, this indecision hung in the air. Nobody was certain what the song was supposed to say, and that was the point. Years later, Lennon admitted he wasn't fully satisfied, but he believed Revolution mattered more than most Beatles songs. Not because it had answers, but because it captured uncertainty, honestly, loudly, and in real time. Number 6, I Am the Walrus, 1967. I Am the Walrus was not written to be understood, and that was exactly John Lennon's point. The song emerged in late 1967, at a moment when Lennon was growing openly hostile toward expectations. Fans were dissecting Beatles lyrics like sacred texts, hunting for hidden meanings in every line. Lennon found it absurd. His response was defiance. If people wanted meaning, he would give them nonsense. When Lennon brought the song to the studio, it was already intentionally chaotic. He stitched together fragments written in different moods, some angry, some playful, some deliberately stupid. The surreal images weren't accidental. They were bait. The recording sessions reflected that attitude. Lennon demanded layers, distorted vocals, heavy cellos, blaring brass, radio static, and random dialogue pulled from a live BBC broadcast of King Lear. George Martin later admitted that the arrangement was one of the most technically exhausting things they had ever attempted. There was no blueprint, only Lennon's insistence that it feel overwhelming. The studio atmosphere was strange but electric. Paul and George followed along, unsure where the song was headed, while Martin worked like an architect trying to stop a building from collapsing mid-construction. The track kept growing, louder, denser, more unhinged, until it barely resembled a pop song at all. Lennon loved that. He later called it one of his favorites, precisely because it confused people. To him, I Am the Walrus wasn't poetry or rebellion. It was sabotage, a way of short-circuiting interpretation itself. For Lennon, this was freedom, creating something so surreal that analysis became meaningless. And in capturing that chaos on tape, the Beatles proved they could turn confusion into art, even when they didn't fully know what they were building. Number 5, Tomorrow Never Knows, 1966. Tomorrow Never Knows was the moment John Lennon stopped thinking like a songwriter and started thinking like a sound designer. When Lennon brought the idea into Abbey Road in early 1966, it barely resembled a song. There was no chord progression, no traditional melody, and no clear structure. Instead, Lennon arrived with a concept. He wanted the track to sound like 1,000 monks chanting from the top of a mountain. That single instruction set the tone for everything that followed. The studio atmosphere was tense but revolutionary. Paul McCartney became deeply involved in experimenting with tape loops, snippets of sound cut, spliced, and played on multiple machines at once. Seagull-like screams, backwards guitar lines, sped-up orchestral fragments. The control room turned into a laboratory. George Martin later said it felt closer to avant-garde composition than pop recording. Lennon was adamant that the songs stay on a single chord, inspired by Indian drone music and Timothy Leary's The Psychedelic Experience. Ringo's drumming, later slowed down, became hypnotic and heavy, something that sounded more like future electronic music than 1966 rock. Perhaps the most radical moment came when Lennon rejected a normal vocal take. He demanded his voice be fed through a rotating Leslie speaker, creating the distant, floating effect that defined the track. Martin initially hesitated, unsure if listeners would accept it. But Lennon insisted. Later, Lennon called Tomorrow Never Knows his greatest recording with the Beatles, not because it was catchy, but because it captured pure transformation. In that room, the band didn't just record a song, they dismantled the rules of pop music and rebuilt them from scratch. Number 4, Across the Universe, 1969.
Words are flowing out like endless rain.
Across the Universe was born in a moment of frustration, and that mood never fully left the recording. John Lennon wrote the song late at night in 1967, irritated after an argument with Cynthia. Words, as he later said, were flowing out endlessly, almost beyond his control. That feeling became the core of the song, thoughts drifting freely, unfiltered, unstoppable. By the time Lennon brought it into the studio, he already believed it was something special. But no one quite knew what to do with it. The initial recording sessions at Abbey Road were strangely restrained. The atmosphere was calm, almost distant. Unlike the controlled chaos of Tomorrow Never Knows, this song felt fragile. Lennon's vocal was gentle, introspective, and unusually vulnerable. Paul McCartney and George Harrison kept their contributions minimal, as if afraid of disturbing the delicate balance. Yet that restraint became the problem. George Martin later admitted the song never quite found its definitive form. Multiple versions were attempted, slowed down, sped up, overdubbed, stripped back. Lennon grew increasingly unhappy, feeling the track was either overproduced or underpowered depending on the take. The famous "Nothing's Gonna Change My World" mantra reflected the recording mood itself, serene on the surface but uncertain underneath. Lennon later called it one of his best songs, while simultaneously criticizing almost every released version. In the studio, Across the Universe felt unfinished, a masterpiece searching for its final shape. That tension between purity and frustration is exactly what gives the song its haunting, timeless quality. Number 3, In My Life, 1965.
As I remember,
In My Life was the moment John Lennon realized he could write honestly, without hiding behind characters, jokes, or rebellion. The song began as a very different idea. Lennon originally wanted to write a long, journal-like piece about places from his childhood in Liverpool. Pages of lyrics listed streets, bus routes, and landmarks. When he brought it into the studio, George Martin immediately sensed something wasn't working. The list felt factual, not emotional. Martin encouraged John to strip it back, to focus less on where he'd been and more on what those places meant. That suggestion changed everything. By the time the band recorded In My Life in late 1965, the atmosphere in Abbey Road was unusually reflective. There was no rush, no experimental chaos, no arguments. Lennon sang quietly, almost cautiously, as if afraid to overstate anything. His vocal delivery was intimate, closer than most Beatles recordings of the time. Paul McCartney contributed the melodic framework, but stepped back, sensing this was Lennon's moment. George Harrison's guitar was subtle, restrained. And then came George Martin's decision that defined the track. The Baroque-style keyboard solo, recorded at half speed to mimic a harpsichord. Martin later said the song marked a turning point, not just for the Beatles, but for Lennon himself. It was the first time John stopped writing at the audience and started writing about himself. Years later, Lennon called In My Life one of the few Beatles songs he was truly proud of. In the studio that day, it felt like something closing and something far more mature opening in its place. Number 2, A Day in the Life, 1967.
I read the news today, oh boy.
A Day in the Life felt less like a recording session and more like a controlled detonation. When John Lennon first brought the song into Abbey Road in early 1967, it was unfinished, fragmented, and deliberately unsettling. His verses were detached, observational, inspired by newspaper stories and everyday tragedies. He sang them calmly, almost coldly, as if narrating events he no longer felt part of. The mood in the studio shifted immediately. Everyone sensed this wasn't a normal Beatles track. Paul McCartney's contribution came later, the brisk, upbeat middle section about morning routine and missed buses. The contrast was intentional, but risky. Two different emotional worlds were being stitched together, and no one knew if it would hold. George Martin became the architect holding it all together. The atmosphere during the orchestral overdub session was tense and surreal. 40 classically trained musicians were instructed to abandon structure, to start at the lowest note of their instrument and rise to the highest, creating pure chaos. Many were confused. Some laughed nervously. Others thought the Beatles had finally lost their minds. John and Paul watched from the control room, half amused, half serious. This wasn't rebellion for shock value. It was precision chaos. Martin later said it was one of the most technically demanding sessions of his career, balancing anarchy without losing control. The final piano chord, played simultaneously by Lennon, McCartney, Starr, and Martin, rang out and decayed in silence. No one spoke. Everyone knew they had crossed a line. John later said, "A Day in the Life was the song that proved the Beatles were no longer a band competing with others. They were competing with possibility itself." Number 1, Strawberry Fields Forever, 1967.
Let me take you down, 'cause I'm going to.
Strawberry Fields Forever was not just a song. It was John Lennon trying to rebuild his childhood from fragments. When Lennon arrived at Abbey Road with the first demo in late 1966, the mood was already different. He was withdrawn, uncertain, and deeply introspective. The song came from a place of memory rather than melody. Strawberry Field, a Salvation Army home near where he grew up, had become a symbol of lost innocence and emotional confusion. Lennon warned George Martin before recording even began, this one mattered. The problem was, Lennon didn't know what the song was supposed to sound like. Two radically different versions were recorded. One was gentle, dreamlike, built around mellotron and soft percussion. The other was heavier, darker, more aggressive, faster tempo, fuller instrumentation. Lennon loved both and hated the idea of choosing. In frustration, he turned to George Martin and made an impossible request. "Can you join the end of one to the beginning of the other?" Martin initially said it couldn't be done. Different keys, different tempos, different feels. Then he found a way. Using tape manipulation, speed changes, and precise editing, Martin fused the two takes into one seamless performance. It was a technical miracle, something no pop producer had attempted at the time. The studio atmosphere during the edit was silent, focused, almost reverent. Everyone understood they were watching the future of recorded music being assembled by hand. Lennon's vocal floated between clarity and distortion, mirroring the lyrics' uncertainty. Nothing is real. The backwards effects, warped brass, and unstable rhythm weren't decorations. They were emotional architecture. Years later, Lennon called Strawberry Fields Forever his most honest Beatles song. George Martin called it the moment recording studios stopped being places to document music and became instruments themselves. In that room, with razor blades, tape loops, and broken memories, the Beatles didn't just make a song. They changed how music could exist.